Hey everyone, welcome back to The Current. I'm joined with Curtis here. We're going to continue in this series going through the Apostles' Creed. It's been a fun series so far. We've just kind of breaking it down line by line. It's been so good. So I encourage you, you can always go back and listen to past episodes. If you've missed any of those, I'd love for you to get caught up because they all kind of tie in and sometimes build off of each other. So yeah, hop on and go back through the archives. You should be able to find those there, whether listening on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Yeah, jump back on and listen. We'd love to have you caught up. And so, yeah, let's jump into today, the next line of the Apostles' Creed.
Yes, let's do it.
Descended into hell.
Mm-hmm. Third day, rose again from the dead.
Third day, rose again from the dead. Oof.
Yeah.
So, my opinion, I think the creed has been pretty open-handed so far. We spent a lot of time talking about how we love about the creed, how it's just kind of loose and it allows for within Christianity some varying thought on some things, but there's some specific, hey, this is kind of a non-negotiable here, but it leaves some room. I feel like a statement like Jesus descends into hell is pretty narrow. I could be wrong.
No,
But it feels that way. It feels like this kind of taking a turn in the creed as in like, this is a very specific belief.
yes,
But
you're totally right. This is, when we're looking through the creed up to now, it's kind of stuff that every Christian everywhere is kind of like, hey, yeah, amen, brother. Yeah, I love it. This is the first line we hit where some people go, whoa, hold on now. And it especially tends to be, our kind of Protestant brothers and sisters. There's a little bit more room for this idea of Jesus' descent into hell amidst kind of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thinkers. Protestants, we don't like that so much, right? Jesus died. We don't talk about this going into hell business. I don't know what Jesus would have been doing down there. And so it becomes this question of where was Jesus for these 3 days? We want to say he died, but what was going on in the midst of those? So the creed tells us that Jesus descends into hell. And I want to say that I don't think what the creed's trying to communicate here is this belief of like, hey, forcing us into saying Jesus went down into hell where there's fire and pitchforks and did stuff. Another way to translate this statement is that Jesus simply descends into death. And I like this a little bit better. I think it's a bit more all-encompassing. It does leave room for those who want to say, no, Jesus made a little bit more of a literal descent into the place of the dead.
sure.
But I think it's broad enough to bring in the people who say, no, we just want to say that Jesus truly enters into the place of death, Sheol, the grave, right? He really does descend into actual death. He doesn't appear to be dead. And so I love this because on the one hand, like I said, it gives room for the people to have a more literal picture of this. But I think it does communicate something that's important, is that Jesus in his descent into death is really going on a rescue mission. And I think this is what the creed's trying to paint for us, is that he goes down into the depths to reach those who have been swallowed by the grave, those who are enshackled by their sin. And so for me, this just points to, Jesus goes to the furthest extent to find us when we are furthest removed from him, right? Even now in the grave, God's presence is there. He's descended even there and is raising people to new life. This is a little bit strange and different for some people kind of hearing it, but I do want to say, this is in the New Testament. We have room for it. I think about 1 Peter talks about Jesus descending and preaching good news to the captives in Sheol, or Paul in Ephesians talks about what does it mean that he ascended, other than to say that first he descended into the lower parts of the earth. The creed's not pulling this out of nowhere. There's language in the New Testament for it. But I think what it's trying to capture, is that vision of a God who goes on rescue. He descends into where we ultimately end up to fill that place with resurrection life.
Yeah, and we've said this before. I mean, what seems like an odd kind of statement, I feel like can really bring a lot of comfort to people too, just because, like you were saying, Jesus is willing to go to all lengths, and he's experienced a lot of the things we've experienced in death and suffering and pain. And so I think there's a lot there just as far as just the average person listening. What seems like such an odd statement can actually bring you a lot of comfort if you'll realize what's actually happening there. Jesus entering into death, just the wickedness of the world, experiencing it, and really the ultimate experience he's experienced too. So it's not just a little bit of pain or whatever. Like he's experienced to the full extent of what our life will too
exactly
be experiencing at
Yeah.
some point. So
And I love, for different traditions have, I think, have different emphasis, and some do better and worse in different areas. And so I think it's good for us to look around to a bunch of different traditions to try to listen and glean from. And so this has been one that the Eastern Orthodox Church especially, I think, highlights and does such a great job. A part of their tradition that we don't really have as Protestants is they have like icons, like these portraits. And so Protestants aren't so much about that. We don't want to deal with graven images, kind of. That's our beef with it. But they have these icons that they venerate. And I love because some of them tell such rich, beautiful theology in a picture. And one of them that they have is where you have Jesus who's reaching down and pulling up two figures kind of out of the grave. And these are supposed to be Adam and Eve. And so this is sort of showing his descent, that Jesus is reaching down and pulling up original humanity. Here we are kind of in our sin, muck and mire, in Sheol, in the place of the dead. And Jesus is reaching down and pulling humanity up. Such a beautiful picture to me.
I love that.
Yeah. They do all sorts of interesting stuff. And we'll get to this. It kind of ties to both sort of the descent into hell and also the raising from the dead. The Eastern Orthodox Church, again, doing some strange stuff. When I was going through college, just across the street from my dorm was an Eastern Orthodox church. And I can remember on the night before Orthodox Easter, because theirs is a little bit different than ours, I looked out my window and I see these people like in full robe investment, like totally decked out, marching with like pictures, and they're just going down the street. And I remember thinking, what the heck is going on here? They march up into the door and go into the church. And I remember for just months thinking, what did I just witness? And it wasn't until later I find out some of the history behind this is that this is sort of their Easter processional. They're marching sort of this victory march that Jesus does out of the grave into resurrection, and sort of marching with him and saying, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death. And so they have room for this vision of, the God who goes on mission, frees the captives from hell, and goes on marching on its victory tour out of it and saying, yes, it's been defeated. Death no longer holds us. Jesus does descend into death, finds us there, takes the keys to Hades and unlocks the door.
Yeah.
Lets all the captives out.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. It's a beautiful picture. And that kind of, you said, kind of ties in with the next part of the creed. On the third day, rose from the dead.
Yes.
I might throw you a little bit curveball here. We didn't talk about this before. But do you think there's any significance in the creed specifically saying on the third day? That's
a good question. And not something I've thought about a ton. I think it's just kind of capturing the tradition still, too, to say, hey, that Jesus dies on Good Friday, is raised on Sunday morning, and there's some weirdness with how that comes out to 3 days. But I think they're just echoing the tradition of what's been captured in Scripture.
Honestly, I think there's like other things throughout the texts we see. It's like maybe some symbolism.
Sure.
3 days.
Sure.
Like that idea too. I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not the focus. The focus is Jesus rose from the dead, which is like
exactly
the crux of what we believe as Christians.
Yes.
The victory moment, you could say. Yeah. So, obviously, there's a lot to talk about. We could go a million different directions.
Yeah, resurrection.
With the resurrection. But I think it'd be cool to spend a little bit of time talking about why maybe the resurrection gained so much traction and why really the resurrection was really the launching pad for what we know as Christianity today. And why can we believe it? Why is it?
Yeah.
Why is it trustworthy? Why? How do we know it happened? Things like that. I think would be helpful.
Yeah.
Spend a little bit of time. Obviously in the creed, this is a foundational truth, and there's, really no getting around this one.
Right.
You know? And like you say, kind of all the time, like if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, like what am I doing?
Forget it.
Yeah, forget it. Like what's the what's the point?
I think Paul gets it right when he says, if Jesus doesn't raise from the dead, like let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. What's the point? I think you're right. This really is the crux. I mean, if you boil down the Christian message to anything, it's the fact that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth, Son of God, who was crucified, died, and raised from the dead 3 days later. Like that is sort of the bare minimum, I think, claim. And so you're right. Yeah. Why in our right minds would we think that this itinerant preacher in Galilee in the first century raised from the dead. What are we thinking? Because that is an outlandish claim. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Dead people usually don't get up, in my experience at least. So why think something differently of this? And I want to say right off the bat, like, I don't think there's any one knockdown, drag-out argument where we say, oh, here's the silver bullet.
Yep.
But I do think there's sort of a lot of different angles we can look at this and say, hey, I think the best cumulative case to be made, I think the evidence best suggests, kind of making an inference to the best explanation, that this tomb is empty Sunday morning. And so I think as a historian, we can begin to look through certain historical facts and instances and say, hey, what is this communicating to us? What makes the best explanation of these facts?
Yeah.
And so what a lot of theologians and Christian thinkers will do is look through some of these facts surrounding the resurrection and say, okay, what best makes sense of these sort of events? And they would argue that it must be the resurrection that sort of best ties these together. And so they'll look at a few different things, like one being fact that we have one is that, okay, first there was a guy named Jesus. We've got that.
Yep.
Only the craziest, outlandish skeptics would try to say that there was not actually a Jesus of Nazareth walking around. But fact number two is that we have an empty tomb. If we know about Jesus from not only our New Testament sources, but from other ancient Eastern sources, that there's a guy named Jesus and he was put to death on a Roman cross, and that this tomb ends up being empty. If, let's say, there's, you got Rome and you have these little Jewish sect of Christians who are saying, oh, hold on, there's this new king in town, his name's Jesus, and they're kind of having this insurrection a little bit. They're getting, they're making claims counter to what Rome would say.
It's gaining some traction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so if Rome wants to put this annoying little movement that's going to give it some problems out of its, just take it away, all they have to do is produce a body.
Yep.
Here's your Messiah. He's still
Exactly.
dead. Chill out.
Yep.
But this doesn't happen. Same thing with the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day. They didn't care for the Jesus movement either. So we have an empty tomb is a fact as well. Now we have some other interesting ones. And I know this is...
First eyewitness testimony of the empty tomb was women.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important
which go to a little bit why the
talking
significance.
About history is evidence too, but the culture signifies this as well. In that time period, women would not have in that culture a trustworthy voice.
Right.
They wouldn't have been heard.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to start this movement, like you're saying, this like Jewish movement, you would not want women to be the voice of like factual evidence in that time.
Exactly.
And that's very strong evidence then for me, just again in that culture that like, wow, okay, maybe this was legit.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I think it's unfortunate that in the first century women didn't have kind of the voice they should, but in terms of kind of bringing forward an interesting argument, it really is, a woman's testimony wouldn't have been considered valid like in a court of law sense. Women don't have a high voice. So if you're
telling a story, why write it that way?
If the disciples are getting together and saying, "Hey, we need to start getting this Jesus thing off the ground, and he died, but we're going to turn it into something else," what you don't do is make your star witnesses to women. Now you're a laughingstock. Now they're like, "Why are we going to believe you?" Yeah, if I'm going to make up a story that says, "Hey, Bo, I can't make it into work today. I had a flat tire," and you said, "Did anyone see it?" And I'm like, this guy that was like way strung out on drugs and all these crazy stuff. Like, no, I'm not going to believe this. If I'm going to tell a lie, I need to make it more credible. So why on earth would the disciples crafting this story? For me, unless you're telling the embarrassing truth, here's what really happened. I just don't see why you'd write it that way.
Exactly. And there's a reason they were going to the tomb, to take care of the body. But,
absolutely.
So cool. It's cool to think about, and I love the idea. This is another topic, but I love the idea that even Jesus in his death is redeeming part of the culture that was so broken and saying like women are such a important thing to me, even in that, I love that idea too, but that's another. Yeah.
A great thing that the person whose testimony is supposed to be the least valid gets to be the first evangelist going around and telling the boys what happened,
Beautiful. Yeah.
Really cool thing. And speaking of the boys, they are also, I think, a good piece of kind of the historical argument for the resurrection, too, is that when you look at the disciples of Jesus, all of them went on to, one, confess that, hey, there's this resurrected Jesus I saw and encountered, but two, none of them recanted that under persecution or death.
Yep.
In the early church, they did terrible things to Christians.
Yes.
Some of the earlier emperors, Nero, some people, would put them in pitchforks and light them on fire. It was not a good thing to be a Christian. So there's one thing to say, hey, I heard about this guy who told me about this Jesus dude, and I'm really believing it. It's another thing for the people who were around and said, I saw these events.
Yeah.
I was still alive during it. I've seen these things. These are Christians who would have been alive in that time, who are being put to death and are not recanting, who are saying, no, I really do believe this. The fact that tradition tells us that the majority of the apostles go on to die difficult, horrible deaths without recanting, I think is a very powerful thing. You don't die over a known lie.
That's right.
Right? So they're either deceived or they really saw Jesus. And again, we can, what best makes sense of the facts there is a good question.
And the parallel you said earlier between Watergate, it lasted a week, or whatever.
That's so good. Yeah, there's a quote by Chuck Colson where he's like, I know the resurrection's true and Watergate proved it to me. And he says, you're taking, Watergate, which embroiled some of the top men in American history at the time, powerful people, and they couldn't hold a secret together and keep their story straight for a couple weeks.
Yep.
And you're telling me that all the apostles went on and never recanted and went straight to death. It's a powerful thing,
Absolutely.
I feel like I have to say either these disciples are just wackadoos. They just they thought they saw some stuff they didn't. But I don't think they're going to death for a known lie.
Yeah, and it was wasn't it Peter who was going to be crucified on a cross, but then, was it Peter?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and then was no, I want to be crucified upside
down. Yeah, church tradition tells us that he wanted the upside down crucifixion over in Rome.
He wasn't worthy of being crucified like Jesus.
Yep. And we see that a bit in the New Testament. He tells Peter when he's feed my sheep, that he's going to be carried away in shackles and that some bad stuff's going to be coming to him. Yeah. And speaking of the other people around Jesus, James is another fantastic example. We have James, the brother of Jesus, who at first is not embracing of Jesus or his message, and yet post-resurrection becomes a huge proponent and becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. What does it take to have a brother go from being no, Jesus, you're crazy, and then saying oh, actually, my brother's the Son of God? It would take a lot for me to convince me that my sibling was God incarnate, know? The fact that James comes out is interesting. And then I think, not least of which, we got to deal with the Apostle Paul. Through his letters.
Who killed Christians.
Exactly.
Majority of his life.
Yeah. Here's another fact. You have Apostle Paul, who is zealously persecuting Christians. He is, zealous for Judaism, is afraid that Christianity is, a hindrance to it. It's a lie. It's false teaching. We need to do away with it. And so the New Testament documents tell us that, he is persecuting the church. And again, all even secular scholars are going to acknowledge that, yes, Paul was a real person. Yes, the majority of letters we have in the New Testament are written by him. This isn't crazy historical claims. But then what do we do with a guy who was at one point killing off Christians, and then the next moment is zealous for Christianity, so much so to the point where he's going and willing to risk his own death to be able to proclaim this message.
Imprisoned numerous times.
Oh, yeah. Beatings, shipwrecks, the whole 9 yards. How do we make sense of this historical data to say we have a Paul of Tarsus who's going on, or Saul, who goes off and then ends up becoming one of the massive voices for Christians? Again, I don't know. For me, you take all of these things and you say, how is it that a small persecuted minority group in first century not only survives under these sort of conditions, but then begins to flourish? How do we make sense of, the disciples? How do we make sense of the women being the people on the tomb? How do we make sense of the empty tomb itself? So for me, there's not one knockdown, drag-out argument, but as we look at just the cumulative case, what best makes sense of all these facts? For me, it's to say maybe there was an empty tomb and this Jesus got out of it. Or maybe there was a mass hallucination, I guess. I don't know. It's a tough spot to be in. So I think, for Christians who are saying, man, this whole resurrection thing, can we really believe it? I want to say, I can't necessarily give you the silver bullet, but I can say it's reasonable. You have justification to be able to say, you're not embracing just outlandish, crazy stuff without having thought about it.
Yeah, and I always say this, not just to people that I meet that are skeptical or on the fence, and I would just say it again. like do kind of the due diligence in studying the resurrection, because I think the crux of what I believe and why I choose to be a Christian, I've said this before, is because I literally believe Jesus rose from the dead. And you may have qualms with the church, qualms with Christianity as a whole, but as a pastor, you probably won't hear pastors say this very much. I'm not a Christian because the Bible tells me so. I'm not a Christian because my parents were Christians and this is how I was raised and I'm brainwashed. I'm a Christian because Jesus rose from the dead. That's what I believe. And there's a lot of things that happen in the church. There's a lot of different thoughts and opinions and beliefs. But at the end of the day, like, believing that Jesus Christ rose from the dead is at the very center of what I believe as a Christian. It's why I am a Christian. And so even if you're not giving the church a chance, Christianity as a whole as a chance, like, give Jesus a chance, study the resurrection, see where you land just on that. And then we can go from there, like what Christianity looks like, how it plays out, and what it means for your life. But like, I feel like a lot of people just don't give Christianity a chance because of how messed up the church is, which is our fault. I'm not making excuses. Like, the church is messed up in so many ways, but don't let that be your guide to really this, a life-giving, way of life, that is so rich, and to me it's full of purpose and meaning, and because of the resurrection. And so I just give the resurrection a chance. It's in the creed. It's this foundational, like, Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the third day. It's
if the problem of physical death has been solved historically, I want to know about it. Right. And I feel like this is this kind of the early church is making a claim. The early kind of Christian witness is making a claim. When you look to Paul's letters right into the Corinthians, he says, some of these people were still around. Go talk to them. Go talk to the witness. He doesn't tell them, well, no, hold on, just believe me. Right? He tells them there's people been around that are still that are some alive that were about for these events. Go talk to them. There was no fear in the early Christian community of like, oh, under the rock, they're going to find this hidden lie that, oh, dang it. There was a very openness. There was a claim. And again, we talked about this last episode, that I love the fact that this resurrection is a historically public event. It wasn't disputing some private religious experience. No, this is a thing where a bunch of people saw this guy crucified, and then the tomb was empty, and a bunch of people even have said to appeared seeing him the following days. This is something like we talked about in the Pontius Pilate part. It's grounded and rooted in history and historical events too, which means that's open to inquiry. You can ask those tough questions and see where they lead you.
And so many of the arguments I see, just even like online and stuff, people are like, oh, it's just a bunch of group of brainwashed people. Like, there are very smart people that are Christians, and that is a fact. So you can, like, it's not because we're all just like, believe in some craziness or we've all been tranced. It's not true. And
exactly,
there's a lot of smart people out there that believe in the resurrection and would consider themselves Christians because of it. So.
And if you want to look for like just speaking of intelligent people who are trying to talk about and defend these sort of things, a person I encourage you to look up, there's a guy named Mike Licona who does some fantastic work around the historical Jesus and kind of the case for the resurrection too. It's kind of his big project. N.T. Wright's another guy that has some fantastic stuff on the resurrection too. He has a really, really big book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. Huge, but great stuff in there, if you want to check out that kind of thing, if you want to see some academic work.
It's good resources. Well, off the top of your head, do you remember what next week is?
Yeah, so we did Descended into Hell. 3 days later, rose again from the dead. Next week, we'll do He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right, well, make plans to join us again next week here on The Current. It'll be more real talk on real topics. Hope to see you then. Grace and peace.